Blood Bowlers. It's episode 8, and we're finally looking at probably the bit that puts the blood in the Blood Bowl, blocking. We've touched everything else so far in previous episodes, but we're now finally getting into that point where you're going to learn how to actually bash your opposition into the ground. It's probably the main reason a lot of coaches want to get into Blood Bowl, the whole idea of the physical part of the game. So we're going to have a little quick look into how you can block other players, how assists work, what the dice actually mean in general, because it can be a little bit complex sometimes seeing these 6-sided dice with multiple symbols on them. So we're going to go into a bit of detail into all of that, as well as looking into fouling and how players can be sort of stamped on outside of a block, and also what happens to those players once they are hurt and how you hurt them and what implications that might have in like a league season. So I guess the best thing to do is get into this and start smashing some heads. All right, guys, we're on the pitch. So I wanted to get a few players out initially for blocking. But before we do that, I just want to quickly explain what blocking is. So blocking is an action that any player can make on your team, as long as they're adjacent to an opposition player, effectively marking another player. So you can't move and block, or block and then move. It's not possible, but you can block with every positional if they're able to. Now, a blitz, which we kind of explained earlier in the movement phase, is a move that you can then block with, but that's a once per turn action. So it's worth remembering that. Check back to that episode to see how you can move and blitz. But effectively, the blocking part of the blitz is what we're going to focus on here today. So before we get into who can block, let's have a look at some different players and what their strength value is. So to block, you need to look at your strength value. Now, we've got a couple of different teams here. We've got a Elven Blitzer here. He's strength 3. We've also got a Chaos Blocker from the Chaos Chosen team. He's strength 4. I guess this is a Gore lineman or a Beastman lineman. He's strength 3. We've then also got on the other side for the Black Orcs, we've got a little stunty Goblin who's strength 2. The Black Orc here, who is also strength 4. And then we've got the Troll, or the big guy, who's a mighty strength 5. So it's worth remembering that when you're blocking, there's a few things to think about in terms of dice. So the dice we're going to look at in a minute, but they're effectively these block dice here with different symbols. And depending on the strength of the person doing the block against the defensive player, kind of gauges your dice quantity. So for example, let's get some equal strength players on this line for the moment. We'll move them out of the way. So here we've got a strength 3 player against another strength 3 player. So the strength 3 blitzer, strength 3 beastman lineman, I guess. And when your strength is the same, you roll one of these symbol dice, or block dice as they're called. So in that situation, you get to roll 1 dice. Now, if you're a higher strength, so let's say, for example, we had our big Black Orc here, who's strength of 4 against this Gore. If you've got higher strength than your opponent, so this Black Orc's blocking, you get to roll 2 dice and you get to pick the result. So you'd roll these 2 dice and pick the result that you desire. If it was the other way around, for example, this Gore was looking to block this Black Orc here, it would be strength 3 against strength 4. So the Beastman player would still roll the dice, but the stronger player of the two, in this case the Black Orc coach, gets to pick the result in this situation, which would have been bad for the Beastman. And we'll get into what those symbols are in a minute. So it works both way around. If you're the stronger player, you choose, or you roll the dice and you choose. If you're the weaker player, you still roll the dice, but your opponent chooses the result. And they're obviously more likely to choose one that's going to be bad for you because it forces a turnover. It's also worth knowing that like a little guy who's strength 2, let's just assume this Troll is on the opposing team. He's strength 5, this guy's strength 2. If you're more than double your opponent's strength, so if it's 5 or above, which in this case the troll is against this little guy because he's only strength 2, you actually get to roll 3 dice and pick the result. And then the opposite way around, if this little guy wanted to try and block the big guy, so strength 2 against strength 5, the goblin coach would roll 3 dice, but the troll coach, or the coach who trolls in the team, would get to pick the result, which is obviously more likely to roll some bad results. So that's sort of showing you what uphill dice rolls are, and of course downhill dice rolls are. So a downhill example would be this troll trying to block this goblin, in which case we've got some great results here. We pick this and smash our guy down. And then the opposite way around would be the goblin trying to hit the troll, in which case there's a bad result here and the troll coach gets to pick. So the troll coach is going to pick this skull, which means actually the player who was doing the block will get knocked down. So uphill and downhill blocks are dictated by the strength of your players. The higher strength you are, more often the more dice you have, but you have to be more than double to get 3. So more often than not, 2 dice is what you're going to be getting for most blocks. Now, that's just one thing in terms of strength on strength. So of course, we've got a few examples previously where we had a strength 3 player versus another strength 3 player. So in this case, we're going to assume we're the Elven Blitzer. We'd be getting 1 dice here because we're strength 3 against strength 3. Now you can do a thing which is assisting a block. So to assist a block, you've got to think about tackle zones again. So the player we're hitting has his tackle zones all the way around here. And of course, he's being marked by this blitzer, which allows him to do the block in the first place. So in that situation, we can try and add some assists to make his dice roll better. So we're going to, maybe move a lineman in or already have a lineman here. In this situation, we're still going to be doing the block with the blitzer, but the Gore has another player in his tackle zones. So this guy here actually will sort of assist the offense in the block. And you get +1 strength for every single time you do that. So in this case, we'd be strength 3 +1, so strength 4, and the Gore would still only be strength 3. So in that case, we've got more strength than the opponent. So we'd actually roll 2 dice in this situation, and we'd get to pick because we're the stronger player, or the elf coach would get to pick because they're the stronger player. Now, it does work the other way around. So let's say, for example, we had some sort of situation like this, where the chaos blocker is in the tackle zone of the blocker, in this case our blitzer again. We've got that tackle zone rolling over the top. Again, we've still got an assist here because it's in the player we're trying to hit's tackle zones. And also over here, we're in the blockee's tackle zones. So in that situation, there'd be +1 strength here for the blitzer to block, but then there would also be +1 strength here for the Gore in defense. So that's like a defensive assist. So actually that would make us strength 4 against strength 4. So that would actually be 1 dice instead. So we'll roll it and we'll see what happens. We would have got a stumble. But anyway, we'll get into that in a minute. So it works both ways. You can get offensive assists and defensive assists just like this. And it all focuses on the players that are doing the hits. So the Gore here had an assist. You could then, of course, have another assist, for example, here as well, because this blitzer then still has 2 players in his tackle zones that are, effectively assisting this guy here. Now, let's say, for example, there's a few other parameters that can come up. So we're obviously assisting blocks here. Let's say for the elf team, they were thinking, right, well, that's a 1 dice block here, which we're not so sure about. It's a bit ropey. We're not so sure we want to do that. Let's say we've got a player at the back here who can move in and effectively tie this chaos blocker up. Now, you can only assist if you yourself have nobody else in your tackle zones. So when there's nobody here, of course, there's the blitzer in this chaos blocker's tackle zones, but he's the guy we're trying to hit, so you have to sort of ignore him. So if we move an elf to this position here, yes, he is still in a position to assist against the offensive block, but he's actually now tied up by somebody else. So being tied up by another player that isn't the player that's doing the block effectively cancels out this assist. So there's a couple of stages to this, but effectively what this would mean is that we would be strength 3, strength 4, because there's no other players in this guy's tackle zones. There's only the guy we're trying to hit. And then we think, right, okay, what's next? Let's have a look if the defense has got any assists. They go, okay, well, this guy is in the tackle zone of the player doing the hit, but there's actually another elf in his tackle zone. So he's not actually a viable assist. So without him there, that would be a 1 dice. But with him there, we'd be strength 4 against strength 3 because this is cancelled out effectively. So it would be 2 dice in the blitzer's favour. And it works the other way really quickly. If there was a gore in this corner here, both of those assists would be cancelled out and we'd be back to 1 dice rather than 2. And there's no limit to how many players can be tied up. So say, for example, we need some more linemen. Let's say we had all of these guys here assisting this block. So it would be strength 3, strength 4, strength 5, strength 6, right? Because those 3 all have their tackle zones onto this gore. But all we need to do, I say all we need to do, but let's assume that there's a gore there. He would cancel out all 3 of their assists because they are all tied up by that other beastman over there. So it's a little bit of a long-winded process, and the best thing to do is to kind of have a little bit of practice with a few players, putting some assists in there, working out what the tackle zones are and who's marked, who isn't marked. But once you kind of get to that thinking of who is assisting in the first place and are they actual legitimate assists, that should help you out. And there's no limit to how many assists you could get. So, for example, we could have, as I just said, a couple here would be strength 3, 4, 5, 6. But then the gore would have an assist here, so it would be strength 4, if that makes sense. So there's no limit to how many assists you can get. Of course, if we had another elf here, he wouldn't count, but he would actually cancel this assist out. It's a little bit complicated. There's many, many ways that it can kind of come up. And there's other skills that come into play like guard and disrupt, I think it's called, that can completely change things. But there are skills that are going to come up later in the game, or later in the league, sorry. So I hope that makes sense. Now we're going to have a little look into what block dice are. All right, guys. So block dice. You've probably been looking at them if you're completely new to the game and just thinking, what are these? Okay, so let's summarize what the block dice is, and then I'm going to show every single example as if we've got a 1 dice block, which is a strength 3 player against a strength 3 player, and show you how that would kind of roll out, and then how it would potentially work for like when you've got to pick a result. So quickly, let's have a little look. So we've got on these dice, we've got the power result over here. We've then got the stumble result, which is this one with the little exclamation mark here, which is effectively a pow light, and we'll get into what that means in a minute. You've then got 2 of these little push symbols, which are these little arrows. There's 2 of them on each side, so you've got a 1 in 3 chance of rolling one of those. You've then got a both down result, which is this little skull and pow symbol here, and then you've got the dreaded player down skull here as well. So there's 5 different symbols. One of them is duplicated, and they've all got their own specific names and the way that they interact with a block. So we're going to assume that we are hitting with our little elf lineman here against this gore. So both players are strength 3. So we're going to be doing like a 1 dice block. Nothing crazy. So in this situation, when it's a 1 dice block, the player doing the block rolls it, and there's only 1 result. So it doesn't matter who picks it because there's only 1 result. So that assisting a block and having greater strength than your opponent doesn't come into play here, but we'll show some examples in a moment. So let's go for probably the most important one to focus on first, the one that nobody really wants very often, which is a push. So there's a 1 in 3 chance of rolling this, and it's called a push back. Now when this happens, the player doing the block gets to pick this dice. This time we roll 1 dice, we roll this, and they get to push the player they're hitting backwards. Now, How that works is when you're pushing them from this direction, you can push them straight back into this square or into the 2 squares either side. So we're going to push this gore to here in this situation, right? Now, if we were blocking from this position in a diagonal, it would be very similar. We'd be pushing into the square directly away from and then either side as well. So it would be these 3 squares. So worth considering where you're pushing from. It's quite important. You can't push a player there, for example, when you're blocking from there or here or there, although there are skills that allow you to do that. We're just going to be pushing this guy to here in this situation. So let's put it back to this. It's worth going on pushbacks now because it affects a lot of the other results. So we're effectively going to push our gore to here. We've rolled a push back, and then the player doing the block gets to decide whether or not they want to follow up. So to follow up means that they get to effectively move into the square that was vacated by the defensive player. So we actually want to follow up there, and then our action would be finished. And that would be it. Unless you're doing a blitz, of course, in which case you'd be able to do your hit. And if you've got any moves left, you can continue to move. But we're just going to focus on blocking. But all of this applies to blitzing. Just remember how that works in the movement episode. So you can kind of keep an eye on that. Now, you never need to roll a rushing roll when you're doing a normal block. You always effectively get to move once into that vacated square if you push them. But that's your action over, remember. So you can't do anything else after this. You can't now suddenly go back to this player and move. He's done. All right, so that's a push. Nice and simple. Now, this elevates when you roll one of these. So either this one or this one. So this is a stumble result, and this is the power result. Now, in all intents and purposes, these 2 dice effectively mean the same thing. Now, let's explain why. So with this, you effectively get to do the pushback, but fabulously, and what we've been looking forward to in all of these episodes is you get to smash the player down onto the floor, pushing them in the same way as you would have done a pushback. So you would have been able to push your guy back into these 3 squares like we'd explained, or if we were pushing him from this direction, we'd be able to smash him down into these 3 squares. So we've just blocked our guy down. Now, you get to follow up just like previous. So in this case, we're going to follow up with our block action and be finished. And then we get to roll on the armour roll. Right. So that's something we'll focus on in just a minute after this. So when a player's knocked down, you do get a chance to hurt them. So that's a knockdown. Now, the difference between these 2 dice rolls, it's worth considering for new players because there are, especially in the new box set, there are players that have dodge. So dodge is an important skill, not just for moving around the pitch like we focused on in the movement episode. It's also important for being hit. So when you're a player with dodge being hit, so we'll grab a little stunty player here, one of our goblins. Let's assume we just rolled this on 2 dice because we are only strength 2. We'd be rolling 2 dice against this guy. We would pick this result. Doesn't really matter in this case. But when you have dodge, you actually convert this stumble roll into a push. So in reality, the elf coach gets to choose a push. There's no other situation where they can power that player down. So although you're going to be getting more dice against stunty players, like a goblin in this case, the only way to really get them down is by rolling a standard pow like this. So the stumbles would convert into a push. That's the best way to think about it. And we push the player and he'd still be standing. And the only way to get him down would be to roll this pow, in which case we would actually get to smash the goblin down. So that is pushbacks, and then how that extrapolates to kind of stumbling and pows. And in both cases, when we pow the player down, we get to roll on the armour because he's been knocked down. And we hopefully can injure somebody, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, there are 2 other options on the dice that you may have noticed. Let's get rid of our little guy again. So, back to 1 dice, strength 3 on strength 3. What in hell's name is this? Now, this is both down. And this is normally a bad result for the player doing the hit. So, unlike the others where you push each other, when you do a both down, there's no pushing allowed. Effectively, when you roll a both down like this, that means that, well, as it says, both players are on the floor. So he would hit the deck, the player doing the block and the gore would hit the deck, the guy who was being hit. And in this situation, both players are knocked down, both players can be injured, and their armour can be broken. And also, because it's this guy's turn, or the elf coach's turn, because his player's gone down, it would be a turnover. So thinking back to those early episodes, it would now be the beastman's turn to go, after we've kind of dictated what's going on with these players. So that's a both down result. However, that can be affected as well. So a little bit like dodge affecting the dice. Let's assume we had the blitzer here. Now he comes with a skill called block as one of his traits and skills. And block is probably one of the most powerful skills in the game, because it truly affects the dice roll when you are trying to hurt somebody. If you roll a both down result when you have block, your player gets to stay standing, but the opposition player gets to hit the deck. Now you'll notice there's no following up, it's just where they're standing. But in this case, it would not be a turnover because our player has block, he doesn't go down. So it's worth just considering when you're playing the game and you're thinking about your blocks, which players of yours have skills that affect the dice rolls, which in this case, our little guy here, or this little elf blitzer, that would have been a nice lucky roll because that both down saved it from being a turnover because of block. Of course, if both players have block, I don't have another player positional with block as an example. Let's assume this gore's got block. Actually, nothing would happen because both players effectively don't go down and they would stay where they are and that block would be finished. So block does cancel it out for both positionals. It also stops anybody from being pushed. It's literally just a kind of quick wrestle where you are. However, if you don't have it, or block, then you're going to go down and you're going to hurt yourself. And then the worst possible result for any player, no matter what skill they have, or how strong they are, is the player down. Now this is the complete opposite to a POW. This means you go down. So in this case, the elf would have rolled this. He hits the deck, and this player stays standing up. And it would be a turnover, and that's about the worst thing that can happen. So yeah, worth considering. One dice blocks, you've always got that chance of there being a turnover. You want to be trying to get those assists in as much as possible. So it's always worth considering. But any player with block is more likely to achieve success, or at least more likely to avoid a turnover. And any player that has dodge is more likely to stay standing when they are the target of a block, as opposed to blocking themselves. It's only like a defensive, passive skill when there's blocking involved. So, how this works with assists or extra strength, let's have a little look. Let's go for this Black Orc's going to have a little bit of a block against this guy. Now, he does have a skill called Brawler. We'll ignore that for now. But let's say this Black Orc, who is strength 4, is going to hit this elf, who is strength 3. That gives him 2 dice to roll. He's going to roll them. He gets 2 results here. So he could pick, because you get to pick when you're the stronger player, remember. You could pick this one if you wanted to. However, this one's even better, because it gets to push the player and smash him to the floor. So we're going to do it. We're going to push him down to this square, going this way, and the Black Orc's actually going to follow, and his action's finished. He's knocked down, and then we get to roll on the armour and hopefully hurt them. Let's do another example. We're rolling 2 dice here. Let's say we roll the worst roll. Double skull. Now we could team re-roll it, but let's assume in this situation we don't have one left, or we were thinking maybe not. This situation, we'd still pick the dice roll because we're the stronger player, but they're both skulls. And unfortunately, a skull is you go down and it's a turnover. So blocking, totally up to the dice. You're going to get a lot more pushes than you would want, but you've got to always kind of accept that a push is better than a turnover, for example. So that's blocking in a simple sense. And again, assists give you more dice and things like that. And when you've got a player that's double the strength, you get 3 dice and you get to pick. And then the opposite way around, the player who's weaker, who's doing a block, the opposition player picks as well. So there's a few other things that are worth thinking about. I'm going to set them up now when it comes to pushing. In all of our examples where we have pushbacks or stumbles or POWs, you've got to kind of take into consideration those squares that are like legible for them to get pushed into. So there are a few examples, and it's called chain pushing in the new rules, which it kind of always has been called, but effectively it's a situation where when you're doing a block, you have nowhere for the player to go, if that makes sense. So in this situation, we're going to assume we're the Black Orc coach, and we're trying to do a block between this Black Orc here and this Chaos Chosen blocker. Now, they're both strength 4, which means that it'll be 1 dice. However, we do have an assist here from this trolley boy here. And then the Chaos Chosen player has no assists because he's got no players next to the guy who's doing the block. And there's nobody tying up this troll. So we go from strength 4 to strength 5, and we're going to roll 2 dice because we are higher strength, and we're actually going to smash the player down with this power result here. So when we do that, we normally push them straight back into the 2 squares either side. However, you'll notice that they're completely occupied. So when this happens, you get to push like an extra player in this in the same direction. So we're going to actually push our goblin in this case. So when there's nowhere else to go, you don't suddenly just put them elsewhere. You do have to still place them into a square behind them. So what we do, we push him into here, but before we can do that, we need to then think about the same rules for pushing this player out. So we're going to push him here, and then we're going to place our blocker down in this square, where we then roll on the knockdown armour roll and potentially injure them, and then we're actually going to follow up to there before rolling that armour result. Now what that does, it means this goblin's now free to do what he likes. He's not going to dodge, but it kind of shows you how you can push players around a little bit. So there will be situations, especially when there's a big scrum in the middle of the pitch, where you're going to need to do this. So really consider how you do it, and it also works this way around as well. Let's just say our guy was here, our little goblin was here, and this guy was here. Now you'll notice that we're going to be blocking the same dice. We'll use the same dice this way instead this time, because we're going from a diagonal. And we're actually going to push the goblin again, but the goblin's getting pushed straight back into these 2. So we're actually going to push the goblin to here before this guy goes down. He'll follow up, and then we'll roll on the armour. So that's chain pushing. It can be used to do things like move the ball carrier around, or help yourself out, move players out of dodgy areas so that they can dodge away more easily. And it tends to happen between really bashy teams. You know, there'll be a big scrum in the middle of the pitch, and you'll be trying to kind of get your own guys out of the way as much as possible. It's always worth considering chain pushing. So something we've not talked about too much is actually your players getting moved off the pitch. Now, we've sort of joked about it in the throw teammate episode, where you can be thrown off the pitch, and then we'll get into what that means in a minute. But it is possible to block or blitz potentially opposition players off the pitch, and it kind of means they're more likely to get hurt. So in this situation, we place the Black Orc here, we've got the Goblin here, and we're kind of thinking, right, we're going to block this Chaos Chosen guy off the pitch. So we're strength 4, we've got an assist here, there's nobody else around. And the Chaos Chosen player is only strength 4. So in this case, would be strength 5, giving us 2 dice over a strength 4 player. We roll this, and again, both down in this case. However, sorry, not both down, apologies. So in this case, it would be 2 stumbles, but we don't have dodge, and not that it matters. And because there's no squares for this player to go into, he actually gets pushed off the pitch. And when that happens, we can still decide to follow if we wish, but I think we'll stay away from the edge of the pitch. And when that happens, the crowd get to rip them to pieces. Now, they may be successful, they may not, and we'll read into what that means in a minute, but it's a great way of removing positionals from the table. It can also work in this situation, for example. Let's say we had a beastman who'd already been down here. We'd be blocking from a diagonal in this situation, and this square's taken, so we can't push him into there, but these 2 squares are effectively empty. He'll be pushed off and still be injured. However, if this guy wasn't here, he has to be pushed into this square here, if possible. So you can't, if there's a space that a player can go into, they have to go there. If there isn't, then yes, they go off the pitch. So that's worth considering. It's always a good way of reducing your opponent's players. And it's also great because it ignores their armour, which is pretty brutal. All right, let's move on to knocking players down. So knocking players down is obviously something you do when you're blocking, but it's also worth considering that it's something that can happen when a player fails a dodge or falls over from being thrown, for example, stunty players. So there's been a lot of situations during the last 3 episodes where we've said, right, this player is knocked down and has a chance of being hurt. So again, in this example, this kind of all aligns with this. So it's worth thinking about that when going forward. So we've got a little Black Orc here who's strength 4. He's going to be hitting our elf. Strength 4 against strength 3. Gets what he needs. He gets the power. In this case, he's going to knock this guy down to here. And like before, he's going to decide whether or not he follows up before we roll the armour. But he's going to stay there just to keep it simple. And then the player who's knocked this guy down gets to roll on the armour roll. Now, what's the armour roll? You'll notice on your roster, along with the strength of the player and the agility, there is a stat called AV, which is a target roll. However, this target roll needs 2 dice as opposed to 1. So our little elf here is armour 8+. And if you roll an 8+, you've effectively broken their armour and they then get a chance to injure them. So we're going to roll it, see if we get through. Well, double 1 doesn't do it. But let's say we rolled 8 on this armour roll. Now that means that the armour is broken. Previously, we'd failed the armour roll. So when you fail an armour roll, the player just stays prone like this, which means that in the elf's turn, he can get up for 3 moves and do whatever he likes. But when you break the armour, you move on to the injury roll, which is in the rule book. And there's 3 different types. 2 to 7 is stunned, which would mean that the player is on his face like this. 8 to 9 means that they move into your knockout box in your dugout and get a chance to come back on a 4+ at the beginning of a new drive, which we detailed in the general principles episode. And then a 10+ on these dice would be a casualty. So it means you put them in the casualty box on your dugout. And then there's a whole stage to what that injury could be. And it might even affect the way your team works for the rest of your league. So we've broken the armour and we're going to roll it. We're just going to roll some dice. We roll a 4 here now for the injury roll. So we consult the injury table. That is stunned. Yes, he stays face down. Stunned players stay face down until their turn ends. So the Black Orc coach will have his turn. We've just done a block. We might do a few other things. And then in the elf coach's turn, this player stays on the pitch. He's obviously got no tackle zones, but he can't do anything. And he can only unstun at the end of the turn, no matter how that turn ends. So even if the elf coach instantly turns over, this player then rolls to prone, and then in the elf coach's next turn, that player can get up and move around like normal. But we've just stunned him. Of course, on the roll of a 8 or 9, this player would have been prone from the block. He would actually be removed from the table because it's a KO. So he'd be removed and then has a chance to come back in the next drive. And then on a 10, 11 or 12, this player again is removed from the pitch and is injured. And it's worth noting that when you do that, the player doing the block gets some SPP. And it works both ways. Let's say, for example, that had been a terrible dice roll and we'd roll double skull, which would be awful for our little Black Orc guy here. The Black Orc coach decides, you know what? I'm going to take it. It's going to be a turnover, but I'm confident with that. This little guy will actually fall over instead because he's still picking the dice roll, even though he did the block, and both of them bad results for the Black Orc in this situation. But in that case, the elf coach would get a chance to roll on the armour, and they're a little bit tougher. So you'll notice that different players are tougher than others, and you need to roll a 10+ to break this guy's armour, which double ones he wouldn't do. So he'd just stay prone on the table until the Black Orc coach's next turn. And again, let's say we broke the armour, we'd get to roll on the injury roll, and in this case, we would have injured him. He would have been casualtied. If we'd broken the armour, that would have been a casualty, sorry. And in that case, the elf coach would have got some SPP instead. So you can get casualty SPP when it's not your turn if your opponent rolls badly. So it's always worth noting it down because you're going to need that for your players to level up in later games. It's also worth quickly remembering that just mainly because there are stunty players in the new box set, that stunty players have a slightly different table for their armour rolls. So if their armour is broken, which is more often than not because they're only armour 7, their injury roll, or their injury table, apologies, is slightly different. So for them, 2 to 6 would be stunned, as opposed to 2 to 7. 7 to 8 would be KO'd. 9 would be badly hurt, which we kind of detailed in the casualty table. So they effectively move straight to badly hurt without a chance of rolling on the casualty table. Even though they're still a casualty for the blocking player that hit them, it gives them a little bit less, gives them a little bit less pressure of dying, because otherwise there's 4 dice results that can kill them off. But then a 10 plus slight previous is still a casualty. So it's you're slightly more likely to injure stunty players if you knock them down, and you're slightly more likely to get them off the pitch by KOing them. So just when you're hitting stunty players, just check that template. Just check that stunty injury table, because it is slightly different to the standard one for every other player. Let's get into casualty rolls. So we've just broken this elf's armor. We've just injured them. We've just rolled a 10 plus for the casualty. Now, the casualty roll moves on to a D16 now. So for the Black Orc coach, we've just rolled a casualty. This guy's going off the pitch. And then you move to another table. I know there's a lot of tables, so apologies for that. But this effectively means you now roll a D16 and consult the table and tell your opponent what they've got. So we rolled a 5, which would be badly hurt. So let's quickly list through what they are. Now, on a 1 to 6, badly hurt means that they're in the injury box, and they can't come back for the rest of this game. So they're going to be in there for however, it might be the turn 1 this has happened, it might be the last turn, but there's no prolonged effects to that player. On a 7 to 9, is seriously hurt, which is a miss next game, or MNG, which is a kind of an acronym for that, which basically means that they are out for the rest of this game, and then they will also miss the next game in your league. So that's worth scribbling down on your roster, and we'll detail that in the next episode, which will be the post-game sequence. But what you want to do is you just want to put a little MNG next to that player, just so you're aware when you need to start doing some admin after the match. A 10 to 12 is a niggling injury and an MNG. So NI and MNG. So they miss the next game as well, and the rest of the game they're currently in. A niggling injury is something that the player holds on to for the rest of the season, which means that they get +1 modifier to this casualty roll instead of the injury roll. So any more of these rolled against them, any more casualty rolls, this is going to be added to. So they're more likely to get hurt. There's then a lasting injury, which is 13 to 14, which affects the characteristics of the players, and is also an MNG. So they miss the next game, and their stat is going to get hurt. So you're going to want to roll another dice to check what that is, and there's another table for that. And then 15 to 16 is deceased, dead, no longer walking this earth. And when that's the case, the players are removed from this game, and they can no longer take part in any other games because they are gone. You actually remove them from your roster, and we'll detail how to do that in the next episode. Lots of different options. It's always good fun to roll, even when you're doing friendly games, just to kind of get used to how you do it. I'd recommend when you're doing your first few games just to kind of do it for a laugh, really, because it can be quite funny when a troll falls over and dies, or a goblin gets thrown off the pitch and gets eaten by the crowd. So worth rolling. And it's also worth noting that when you do get pushed into the crowd, so like we just detailed previously, the crowd doesn't have to roll on the armour. So normally the players have a little bit of a benefit. Their armour can save them more often than not. But when you're pushed into the crowd rolls straight onto the injury roll. So they completely negate the armour and roll straight away and knock the player out. And when you're pushed off the pitch, if you are stunned, you go into your reserve box and they can come on for next drive or the next drive. Knocked out, exactly the same. They go into the KO box, and injury or casualty, they roll on that D16 roll, unfortunately. But the player who pushed them off the pitch doesn't get the SPP. So it's worth noting that if the crowd rip a player to pieces, nobody gets SPP. It's just the good old nod to the crowd for a job well done. Right, so what else can you do to keep your players alive? Well, there is a thing called an apothecary. Now, we talked about this in the rostering episode. It's something you might want to consider purchasing, but it's a 50,000 gold piece part that you can purchase for the team. You can purchase it further down the league. You don't necessarily need to buy it straight away. But like we previously said, what happens with an apothecary is when you roll a badly hurt result, which was the 1 to 6, effectively, if you use your apothecary, you can bring them back into your reserve box. So how it works is you'd effectively roll once. In this case, we would roll a 9, which would be a seriously hurt. So it would be MNG. But we're thinking, you know what, we're going to use our apothecary for this player. So we'd roll again and we'd apply the best result. Again, it's a 9. So it'd be MNG. But if one of those results had been badly hurt, then that player gets to go into the reserves box. So effectively, the apothecaries patch them up enough to move them across, but you can only use the apothecary once per game. It can also be used for a knockout. So if a player is knocked out as opposed to injured, obviously they're going off the pitch, you can use your apothecary to keep them on the pitch but stunned. So kind of as like a, well, you know what, my guy's going off, he's knocked out, but I'd like to keep him here stunned rather than not have him on the pitch at all, for example. So there's 2 different ways to use it. You can also purchase inducements that do the same thing if you don't have an apothecary or if you feel like you need some more. But remember, it's once per game rather than once per drive or whatever. So once per game. And you're going to want to hold on to it for your more expensive players. So a lot of linemen in this situation are going to get injured and die. Needlessly, you could say, because you want to try and keep your more expensive players alive, like in this situation, the blitzer. So I hope that makes sense. That's kind of how injuries work, and we'll get into what that means for your team going forward into other games. But now we're going to move on to the dirtiest part of the game, which kind of takes all this into account, which is fouling. All right, guys, let's get into this dirty fouling. So it's worth noting that fouling is something you can only do one of per turn. So a little bit like a pass or a blitz action is something that only one of your players can do. However, as good as it can be to remove opposition players, and it certainly can do that, it can also mean that you could be caught. But before we get into that, let's actually see what a foul would be. So one of your players, in this case the little goblin, can jump up and down or foul a prone or stunned opposition player who's adjacent to them. So in this case, we would jump up and down on the blitzer. You can additionally move into position to do a foul, but then you cannot move any further once it's done, if that makes sense. A little bit like a pass if you're passing the ball or a handoff. Once you've done the foul, you can no longer continue to move. Now, how do you roll a foul? Effectively, you get to roll straight against the player's armour without rolling blocking dice. So blocking dice aren't used. It's just straight onto armour rolls. So in this case, this little elf blitzer's armour 9+, so we'd need to get a 9+ to foul him, or to get through, sorry. So we would actually achieve it there. We'd roll an 11, it's broken his armour, and then we'd roll on the injury roll, etc., just like we did detail previously. So it effectively bypasses that block stage, but gets all of the other goodies of trying to injure players. So we could turn this prone blitzer into a stunned blitzer. We could also turn that prone blitzer into a knockout, or even better, a casualty. Now, it's not worth noting here, you don't get SPP for inflicting casualties through fouling. It's just not cricket. So you do not get that. However, it's a great way of trying to remove players if you've got the advantage. Now, assisting a foul is a little bit like a block in terms of it uses the same rules. However, you don't really use additional block dice. You don't get to use additional D6. You effectively add to your dice roll. So let's say we had 2 goblins here who are assisting. Now, of course, this player's not got any tackle zones, but effectively we're adjacent to this player with 2 extra guys. So we get to get 2 added to our dice roll. So we'd need a 9+ normally. So that would be a normal failure here, luckily. So that's a 7. That would get 2 added to it, which would become a 9, which is exactly what we need to get through this guy's armour. And then we will roll to see what we do. And we don't add assists to the injury roll, worth noting. However, he is now knocked out and removed from the table entirely. So a very effective foul. It additionally works the other way. So let's say, for example, we had a player here for the elf team. We would get 1 assist here, but then there would be an assist for the downed player, which means that we would only actually get, well, there would be no modifiers. It would be +1, -1 in this situation. So we would be straight onto 9 plus to injure him, which we still achieve. But anyway, you can see how the assists work. It's always worth considering who's eligible. And another example might be, you might have, for example, 2 guys who could assist. However, this guy's been tied up, just like with a block. So he's cancelled out, but it still gets +1 to the dice roll instead, which again would have been a 10, would have broken his arm, and we hopefully could have done some damage. Now, it's worth considering, like we'd mentioned previously, that every time you foul, there's a chance that this little chap here, the referee, might spot you. So let's say we were going to jump in and foul this guy, and we'd rolled a 5-5, like this. Now, anytime you roll a double for either the armour roll or the injury roll, the ref spots you. So there's quite a high chance of you being spotted, so you've got to be very careful. However, you don't stop at this stage. You just note, I rolled a double, okay, on the armour roll, and then you roll on the injury roll. In this case, we would turn the elf stunned, but we go back to that double, and it means that this player is going to be sent off. Now, when you are sent off, it is a turnover. So these are things you're going to want to do at the end of your turns, unless it's absolutely crucial that you need to do it. So because of that 5-5 for the armour roll, we now have to try and argue the call if we want to keep our player on the pitch. So to do that, you need to roll a dice and consult the table. So really, the only way of keeping your player on the pitch is a 6, but even then, it's still a turnover. So if we rolled that 6, the ref goes, all right, but don't do it again. But then the turn would still end, and it would be the elf's turn to go. A 2-5 means that the player's sent off and a turnover is caused. So when you send a player off, you can either put them in your injury box or just put them off to the side. But effectively, they're not coming back for the rest of the game. They've been sent to the dungeon. And on a 1 for arguing the call, it means that the player's sent off still, so he'd be gone, and it's a turnover, and the coach himself, in this case you, gets sent to the stands effectively, and you get -1 modifier for brilliant coaching when it comes up on the kickoff event. So when you're arguing the call, worth looking at, it also means that you can no longer argue the call. So if you roll a 1, your ability to roll this dice is gone. So any more doubles on fouls are going to be sending offs. So you can see how fouling can be really effective. You're going to want to get a lot of assists in there to really maximize your chances of getting a player off, because you don't want to lose a really important player by rolling a double and not even hurt the elf that you're trying to stamp on. So quick rule of thumb, you're probably going to want to stand on players that are really important for your opposition. So in this case, this blitz is pretty important, one of their best players or one of the catchers. But you're only going to want to do it when you've got that ability to kind of get as many pluses to your armour roll as possible. You don't want to be trying to foul him on a 9. You're going to want to try and get 3 or 4 or 5 assists in there to do it and really gang up on him. But there are other ways, of course, of hurting people. The blocking is the best way, and there's no way of getting sent off. Of course, pushing players off the pitch is another great way to remove positionals. But it also works the other way around. You know, if you foul someone and you get sent off, suddenly, oh no, I'm down on players. It's something you're going to want to do when you start to get a head of steam. You know, you might have injured a few elves. And then you're thinking, well, if I start to foul people as well, I can get rid of most of my opposition's players. And that's a really brutal way of approaching Blood Bowl. But for the Black Hawk team, for example, it doesn't take many elves to score a touchdown. So you're going to want to try and get rid of as many as possible. whether that's through blocking, fouling, pushing them off the pitch, whatever you can do to remove them, that's what you want to do. And just like for the elves will be like, well, we're not going to really get many hits on the Black Orc players, but we can really get rid of those goblins. And the goblins are the Black Orcs' only real way of scoring and moving the ball. So it works both ways. And because they are stunty players, they are more likely to get hurt. So I hope that's helped. That's fouling, and that's sort of being knocked down, armour rolls, and how this whole part of the game kind of sort of works. It's probably the most fun part, the most brutal part. It's why it's called Blood Bowl. I hope it makes sense. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments box below. And I'm sure this is going to be a bit of a long episode. So in the next episode, we'll jump into the post-game sequence and what you need to do to get your team ready for the next game, really. We're going to kind of summarize a few things that might have happened in this game, the Black Orcs versus the Elves, and we'll see how the teams look for the next one. So take care, and we'll join you next time. Bye.